Hey guys, welcome back to the first in a series of build videos on this ASH30 scale glider. It's a 9-meter wingspan, all composite. And I have a tip panel on the bench here. That's what we're going to start with. And we need to install 3 servos. So we have 3 ailerons on this panel. Some might consider this surface a flap, but it doesn't really matter. And the servos I've been sent by the customer are these Servos. So I have 2 HV120s for the inboard aileron and the middle aileron here. And then we have this HV85H, which is a fairly small wing servo for the outermost panel. And to go along with all that, we have some Thomas Lu IDS mounts here. These are machined carbon mounts. They have a third bearing support. I don't know if maybe these aren't IDS mounts. They're maybe just regular servo mounts because they kind of come with regular servo arms and some unique horns that go into the surfaces here. So the first thing I'm going to do is kind of prep the servos and the frames and get them assembled and see how that looks. So I have the servos and the frames loosely assembled here on the wing, and this is the smallest one, the HV85, and it's going to be pretty tight. If I get it in here, the arm on the outermost position's kind of poking out, but there's another position and I think that'll be fine. I'll have to grind down the outer holes on this arm here, so that'll sit in something like that. And then the middle aileron, I'm gonna have to run the servo pretty far back in order to clear the skin here. Like if I was to run a ruler across, it's gonna have to be something like this to get it all to work. And I'm gonna have to also use the inner hole on that arm and grind off the top holes, which is okay. And then the innermost panel here, this all works just fine, and everything clears. So I do have the option of running that furthest hole there, but we'll have to see how the geometry turns out. After I was thinking about this a little more, I think it's going to be a good idea to get the horns in the surfaces, or at least position them, before I proceed to actually glue frames in or do anything like that. So what I've done is marked off the center line, so right in the middle there between the 2 arms, that center line where I want it. And for the inner flap, it's going to be 15 millimeters. That's just simply because the wing's thicker here, and I have more room to push the servo back to be able to unbolt it, slide it back, and get it out. So 15 millimeters there, and then moving to the inner panel, I've gone with 8 millimeters, and that's because the wing is thinner, and the servo, I want the servo to be closer to this edge so that when I unbolt the servo and push it back, I have more room here to be able to get it out. Okay, and then over here with the smallest of the servos, I've gone with 10 millimeter offset from this edge. I'm talking about this edge here. And so I just used a ruler and measured 10 millimeters, and then what I've done is use the square and deflect the surface and move the square to my mark, draw the line, and then same thing this way, deflect the surface, use the hinge line basically as a butt for the back of the square, and then continue the line, and then I've continued that basically all the way around to the top surface. Let me show you how I did that real quick. So if we flip this over, I had a little mark on the trailing edge, and what you can do is just run the straight edge into the gap there, and then line it up with the mark and draw your line up here. And this is going to ensure you have nice perpendicular lines to the hinge line of the surfaces. So now what I need to do is start cutting the slots here for my control horns. And I have a big bag of various size control horns here that I was sent. So hopefully there's, you know, the right size for each application here. These are about 2 millimeter thick carbon fiber machined horns. So we're going to start opening up the slots for those horns. Alright, so I'll show you where I'm at now with the surfaces here. I have cut and filed slots into the trailing edges to accept the horns, and that is a lot of kind of going back and forth and trial fitting and all that, and yeah, kind of a pain in the butt, but it's working out. So I have these two surfaces done, and the tip here, because this is so thin out here, I don't think I'm gonna have a completely internal linkage. So basically you are gonna see the horn sticking up, and we'll have to cut the top surface away a little bit. It's just too thin. This Thomas loose stuff, it's really good, but you know, some of the clevises are kind of bulky, and yeah, there's just not enough room here to keep everything internal. So this horn will be coming up out of the surface. That's okay though, because it'll get us pretty good servo resolution there. And yeah, so the next step is, once I get the horn prepped for the very outer aileron, then all three of the surfaces are ready to accept those carbon control horns. And I've been playing around with linkage lengths. So this threaded rod here, I figured out for the very inner panel I need a 32 millimeter rod, so I have to trim that threaded rod down a little bit. And then I'm going to do the same thing for this middle panel, figure out what length rod I'll need. It's going to be shorter than the other one. Yeah, and then basically what I'm going to do is kind of try to get all the horns in place and the servos test fit, and just make sure everything's working, and then we can move on to actually gluing everything in place. And one quick thing I wanted to go over was when actually cutting or opening up these slots in the surfaces, and I forgot to mention I had to open up slots or holes in the sub-trailing edges, or sub-spars I should say. You can see that one there. And moving on to the middle panel, there's one there. I used a variety of tools. So this is basically all the tools that I used. There's a small, this is basically a 2 millimeter or maybe a 1.5 carbide cutting bit for your rotary tool, or Dremel if you want to call it that. And then this one, kind of a round head bit. I like this one a lot for some of the fine work. And for the sub spars, I used this one to basically just start the holes, or basically get a hole through. Then I moved on to these two guys, and also used a lot of these files for the sub spars. For the surfaces to accept the control horns, Basically started with this guy to kind of get some thing that looks like a slot going, and then I moved on to the files. So these flat files happen to be 2 millimeters wide, so they're basically the same width as the carbon control horns, and the one with the pointy end lets you work into the trailing edge, and this one is kind of a half round. It's kind of a domed shape on each side, and this works well too. I use this kind of at the finishing stages of the subspar holes. So really handy to have a lot of stuff like this on hand to do, just to keep your work clean. Okay, we're about ready to glue the control horns into the surfaces here, and I'll just show you kind of what that looks like. There's the outer panel, outer surface, and there's the middle one right there, and it pushed out a little bit, but that's okay. And then for the very outer aileron, I wasn't able to get the Thomas Lou aluminum clevises to work out for me, so I had to switch to a regular steel clevis there, but I am going to the Thomas Lou servo arm and the frame and all that in here. But this is just going to be the easier setup. And then let me retract these surfaces and show you what that looks like. So the very inboard surface is fully internal, and then the middle aileron here sticks out just a little bit right there, and the very outer sticks out a little more. There's a lot of going back and forth and trial and error with finding the right carbon control horns, and I did have to modify the horns somewhat to get them to work for me. It's all going to be unique to whatever your model requires, so it's not just like a plug and play setup. There is a lot of grinding and modification to be done, and at each location I've made myself some notes, like this, like 10 millimeters here is the depth of this cutout I had to make for the clevis, and then I have a note here, 30 millimeter threaded rod that's 3 millimeters in diameter, 30 millimeters long, 3 millimeter threaded rod. Same kind of stuff out here, 2.5 millimeter threaded rod, 25 long. This slot is 11 deep. So make yourself notes as you go so you can try to replicate everything on the opposite panel. Alright, so I have all the horns prepped and sanded and cleaned off with some alcohol, and the linkage arms are attached for the rods, and I've gone ahead and put some slow cure epoxy in all the horn locations, all three, and we're going to go ahead and sink these horns in and make sure everything is where we want, and then we'll let this cure overnight. Alright, so there's my epoxy there, and it's thickened with some Cabosil. Kind of makes you want it fairly thick like peanut butter. And I went ahead and sunk in the horns. Put plenty of epoxy in the slots before I pushed the horns in, like as much as I could possibly get in there. And you can see over here, it's kind of hard to see, but there is like nice fillets of epoxy around the base of the horns. This one too. And then I have the wing kind of propped up like this with the surfaces deflected down, and it's butt up against this box of ballast, and over here I have the butt of my drill on the leading edge, so this can't move. And we'll let this cure overnight, and the next thing to do after that will be basically to glue in the servos, or the trays, and this wing panel will be pretty close to being done. All the control horns are now glued in. The epoxy is fully cured, so that's great. I do have the linkage arms attached at all 3 points. And the next thing I did was, just to get ready to bond the servos in, I have scuffed up the bottom surfaces of these mounting plates, And I took a cutoff tool and just put some little notches in the corners just to give the resin some more bite. And as well, I've scuffed up this surface because this is where this bearing mount is going to attach, right there. And I didn't scuff up these surfaces because they're machined, but I did put some notches in these bearing plates, again with the cutoff wheel. And I did that to all three servo locations, all three sets of mounts. And again, I cleaned all these off real nice with alcohol, so they're ready to go. The next thing to do is going to be to get the servos centered up and reassemble them on the mounting plates. And I'm going to try to put some plastic in there to keep the resin off the servo, so I'll show you that when I'm done with that. And I might put a tiny little drop of thread lock in these as well when I screw the servos down. Real quick, while I was moving the surface up and down, seeing how much travel I could get, and the servo placement, I noticed that it wasn't getting a lot of up. And considering that this whole surface, or all three of these surfaces, are going to be moving as ailerons, that was a bit of a concern. So it turns out that at the root here, there's a buildup of resin and materials, and you can see on the moving part there's a flat part there, and that was basically interfering, or these two surfaces, this one and this one, were hitting each other. So all I did was took a file to this and removed just a couple millimeters of material, and I'm able to get quite a lot more up travel. So that's one thing to look out for if you ever happen to build one of these. Okay, before I proceed with getting the servos installed, what I want to do is get the servos for the opposite wing panel, or the right wing panel, ready. And I want to make sure that my horns are all matched up, because I want to try to keep the geometry between the wing panels as identical as possible. So you can see here, these guys are good. They're matched up. That's center. And then over here, this one is a little off, so that horn needs to go back a little bit. And then for the smaller servos, they're matched up really well. So what I found out is that these chas servos, pretty sure they're made by KST, because the KST servo programmer will actually work on this servo. So let's go ahead and try to match these servos up. So let's go ahead and hit enter, and then we'll move the arm, and that's looking pretty good there. And then we'll hit enter again, and that should save it right there, but we'll just verify with the servo tester. So I have my servo tester hooked up to the servo. It's centered here, and when I plugged in the servo, the arm did not move at all. So these two are now matched up, and I've done the same thing with all the servos, so they're all matched up. So in preparation for gluing the servos in, I've put a thin film of plastic around the bottom of the servo, and these screws actually go through it, kind of hold it in, and I've kind of just taped up the back like that, and that'll just ensure that we keep all the resin off the servo. And I'm going to go ahead and do that to all three servos. So we're just about finally ready to glue these servos in, and I've undone all the linkages from the horns and pulled them out, and I've run the pins through the servo arms there. And something really important to note is put the pins in before you glue the end plate on. Otherwise, it's a challenge, or you won't be able to do it. So the end plate's just tacked on with CA, and then we'll get some epoxy in once it goes in to reinforce it. But really quick, these pins require E-clips, and I guess this is a tool from Thomas Liu?
Yeah.
So I highly recommend getting this tool. if you're gonna install a lot of these frames, because otherwise this could be a real pain. But you can see, I don't know if you can zoom in on that, but you can see how it holds the E-clip there.
Yep.
And we'll just put one on to show you how it goes.
Hey Ollie, does it come with that sandpaper?
Yeah, it comes with various grits. So I'll finish up the E-clips off camera, and then after that, what we're gonna do is basically fish these servos in, and I've already tested everything, so they do go in. And then we'll hook them up at the surfaces. But before we put the servos in, we're gonna get epoxy in here. And I've already gone ahead and sanded the bays with coarse sandpaper, and I wiped it down with alcohol. So it's all ready to go. I'm gonna finish up the E-clips, and then we're gonna mix up some resin and finally get these servos in the wing.
Now, just a little, you want to maybe hint on why it's important to have the pins plugged in for alignment?
These pins?
So the reason why you would want to fish the horn like that, aside from not being able to...
Oh, okay, yeah. So with these Thomas Lou frames, you really have to think ahead multiple steps and pre-plan everything. Everything's real tight, and everything's kind of a pain in the butt to work on. So if you had your control rods attached here, there's really no way to get the servo and the frame in and then put the pins in.
Right.
So, yeah, you basically have to have these end plates glued on. The only way you could avoid that is if you had the servo in the cutout or the bay, like really far back, and you had access to all this stuff, which you could do, but then you got to deal with getting the servo under the wing. And this servo and this one here, the 85. They don't really squeeze in under the skins.
It's a tight fit.
Yeah, they have to be in the opening, so that forces you to run this bearing support this way, and basically you don't have the room to get the pin in and then try to get the bearing support in place, and it's like doing surgery.
Yeah,
if you're gonna do it that way. So
it is pretty difficult.
Yeah, Carlos gave me some tips with this, and this is really the best way to go, is to hook up your linkages and then fish everything in. You might have to move the horn down to get everything to work. But
yeah,
then,
sometimes you do, depending on the wing profile.
Yeah, and then put it back on the tester once it's in place and get the horn back up, so you got everything where you want it to go. Yeah, I would say with the Thomas Lou frames, you just really have to think ahead and just think of every step ahead of time and test fit everything. And just go through the motions of, oh, how am I going to get the resin in here? How am I going to get the servo in here? How am I going to get the pin in? If you try to do those things before you actually mix up the resin, you're going to figure out that there's a certain order that everything has to go in for all this to work.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah, so that's it. So I'm going to mix up the resin, and we're going to get these servos in. Got the epoxy in there, as you can see, and I've put some masking tape around the bays to protect the skin, because this could get a little messy. So we have that going on all 3 servo locations, and then on the servos I have put a little bit of resin on the bearing block to hold that down better, and now we're going to fish these servos in. Alright, before I put weights on the servos and kind of do the final alignment, I have taped up all the surfaces here to neutral, so that with the servo centered, the surfaces are pretty close to being neutral, so we shouldn't have any major sub-trim issues here. Here's the almost finished product. Everything's in place and lined up. We're connected here at the horns on all 3 locations, and we have some weight just holding the servos down. That's how it all looks. So we're just gonna wait for this resin to cure overnight, and then we'll see what we got. Okay, well, the epoxy is cured overnight and everything's looking pretty good. We're just gonna go and test all the servos. So I have my servo tester here, and it's hooked up to the servo, and we're just gonna see if we get the kind of travel that we need. That's looking great there. Okay, onto the middle aileron. Looking good. Onto the very outer aileron. It's looking really good. So happy with all that. Next thing we're gonna do is put a couple drops of thread lock on all the screws. And while I do that, I might try to pull the plastic out as well, just to clean up the servo bays. That's basically what the finished install looks like, with the plastic out and the tape off, and the screws are thread locked. Looking pretty neat and tidy. Well, next up on the list is to start working with the wiring harness in the wing panel. So I have my wire laid out here. And we need to put the servo connectors on these ends to mate up with the servos. And over here we're going to use a 6-pin multiplex plug, and we're going to have to put a hole into the root here somewhere to accept that plug. And since this is such a big heavy model, I'm not going to worry about reducing the amount of wires in the wings. I want each servo to have its own wire for redundancy. I'm not concerned about shaving 20 or 30 grams off this model. So we're just running a wire, separate servo wire for each servo location. Here's the beginnings of our wiring harness. I've crimped on the other servo ends connectors here. All the way down. And I'm just gonna leave those like that for now. I don't want to put the multiplex connector on until I've kind of got the center panel to work with as well, because I've been going back and forth on whether to make this plug and play. The fit of these tips might not be precise enough for that, plus there's a lot of flexing and bending that's going to happen, and I don't want that connector to break or fail or anything. So I'm thinking I might have the connector just hanging out here, and then on the root panel they'll be firmly glued to the end of the panel, so you'll have to grab the wire and plug it in and then slide the tip on. And I think that'll just be better for safety as a precaution. So I guess the last thing I'm going to do on these panels before I move on to the other tip panel is I'm just going to cut out the servo covers, the servo bay covers, and just tape those in place temporarily, because I don't want to completely seal that up until I get all the wiring ran through and everything's all finalized. Well, this is the sheet they give you for servo covers, and obviously they have big bulges for really large servo arms, which we don't need at all. But luckily there's enough space in between all these to get flat panels cut out of here. And I've just sort of drawn one here with a pencil. It's 50 by 60 millimeters. Use a little square to get that going, and I'm just gonna cut this out and test fit it and see how it goes. Well, here we go. This is pretty much a 90% complete tip panel for this ASH30. I cut the servo covers out and they came out real nice and clean. See two of them here, real tight. And I'm gonna call that one good there. We'll finish up the wiring once we're kind of ready to mate these up to the center panels. I'm really happy with all the installation on this, and I think we're going to move on to maybe putting the spoilers in the center panel. So look out for a center panel video or maybe a tail video or something coming next, but I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and we'll see you soon. Bye.